B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, April 16th, 2020. Been a busy day here at the Secret Studio. Got a great interview releasing to subscribers today with Norman Solomon, the Democratic activist and a longtime supporter of Bernie Sanders. He offers critical commentary on the Sanders campaign and on Joe Biden's prospects for winning in November. And I'll say that Norman is a little bit more measured than I am, but we have many areas of agreement and some places where you may not agree. I'll have a clip from that coming up in this podcast, and the full episode will be available to subscribers just a few minutes after this episode is posted today. We begin with some encouraging news from Montana related to the Keystone XL pipeline. But first, to paint the global picture, as you know, there is a huge oil glut, and storage facilities are nearing capacity as the price continues to remain extremely low. And this is fueling, if you'll pardon the pun, efforts by the Keystone owner, that's TC Energy Corporation, and Enbridge, one of the other big pipeline operators, to plead for fresh crude to keep their pipelines full. Now, I suspect that there's an issue about safety, that if you get air gaps in the pipeline because you're not pushing that crude down the line, that this could, under the pressurized conditions of these sludge tubes, create problems leading up to leaks. And there is also the collapse in demand because of the worldwide pandemic and this drop in oil prices. So as these companies are reeling, they are facing some negative decisions from federal courts. That's American federal courts. And the main actor here is Judge Brian Morris, who sits on the bench in Billings, Montana. And yesterday, he canceled a key permit for the Keystone XL oil pipeline, another setback for the disputed project that got underway less than 2 weeks ago following years of delays. So Judge Brian Morris said the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers failed to adequately consider effects on endangered species, like the pallid sturgeon, a massive dinosaur-like fish that lives in rivers that the pipeline is intending to cross. Well, pipelines can't intend, but you know my point. The companies want that. This ruling does not shut down the work that began at the U.S.-Canada border just a couple of weeks ago. And TC Energy, formerly known as TransCanada, will need this permit for future construction across hundreds of rivers and streams along the 1,200-mile route. So Anthony Swift with the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the groups that challenged that permit, said it creates a significant hurdle for the project. Regardless of whether they have the cross-border segment, Keystone XL has basically lost all of its Clean Water Act permits for water crossings. Now, there is another hearing that's being held just about now in Montana, and Steve Volker, who's the environmental attorney based in Berkeley, California, who has been on our program several times, he is arguing a brief before Judge Morris for injunctive relief. That is, a court order to stop the dam construction. And it appears there's a tag team effort by various environmental legal teams to build on the ruling that came out yesterday and to move for a court order to block the construction that is already underway. So in its response to the action under the Endangered Species Act, TC Energy has confirmed that it's moving ahead with the surface disturbing activities that the plaintiffs have previously asked this court to prevent in order to maintain the status quo and avoid irreparable environmental harm. So they've got the pipeline people kind of cornered. This judge has shown a willingness to challenge the Trump administration in its efforts to just bulldoze the permit process and American law, plus the treaty between the U.S. and Canada that made this a federal issue. And Volker argues The Keystone will cross scores of water bodies and wetlands between the border crossing with Canada and the Missouri River, 90 miles into the United States. And these water bodies include many that flow into the Missouri River, a source of drinking water for plaintiffs residing on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. So this is encouraging news at a time when most of the environmental news we hear is disturbing. Yesterday, it was that the coal lobbyist Andrew Wheeler, who now runs the Environmental Protection Agency, had decided not to pursue tighter regulation of soot emissions from mostly coal-fired power plants. And following today, the EPA is expected to announce weaker regulations on the release of mercury and other toxic metals from oil and coal-fired power plants. The final EPA rule does not eliminate restrictions on the release of mercury, but they use sleight of hand by reducing the health benefit of regulations on paper while raising their economic costs. They create a construct that the cost benefit doesn't justify the continuation of these rules, and this could make it harder in a future administration to return to where those rules are today. So, a plan to weaken CO2 emissions at power plants, for example, predicted as many as 1,400 additional premature deaths per year. A draft analysis of the soot policy put forward this week showed that tightening the existing standard by 25% could save as many as 12,000 lives per year. So this shows the callous disregard for the impact on humans of corporate polluters. And I want to recommend a review compiled by Kevin Gostola at Shadowproof and published today of the opportunistic moves that have been made during the fog of the pandemic. And while Trump distracts everybody every day with his clown performance at the podium in the White House press room. And under the environment, Gostola lists power plants, vehicle manufacturers not required to lower emissions, that the EPA has waived regulation on pollutions for corporations, claiming it has something to do with the pandemic. And he notes on foreign policy, they're moving for regime change in Caracas, that the Justice Department has made these phony charges against President Maduro of narco-terrorism, while the State Department intensifies crippling sanctions against Iran. Under immigration, the Trump administration is suspending immigrant, non-immigrant visa services for guest workers from Mexico. And this might, give Stephen Miller a boner, but farmers desperately need this foreign labor because the population in the United States is not willing to do farm labor. And as the market demand has slacked, farmers are plowing under crops that are ripe right now, and they're deferring the next round of planting because they don't have a labor supply to bring in the crop when it's ready. Also, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, has issued a rulemaking making it harder for workers to unionize. BlackRock has been appointed by the Federal Reserve to oversee the $4.5 trillion slush fund for the purchase of corporate debt. The nuclear industry is clamoring for a bailout, and so it goes. Over at Mint Press, Alan McLeod is pursuing the reporting he did yesterday about who's profiting from the coronavirus response. And he notes that in the so-called CARES Act is a series of Republican tax cuts that will save the ultra-wealthy $90 billion this year alone. And here's the big takeaway. If you recall, when I first scanned the language of the CARES Act and the multiplier effect of the money that's been given to the Federal Reserve, it amounts to over $6 trillion. And on the back of an envelope, I calculated that that's about a 6-to-1 corporate to human benefit. Well, I was off a little bit. 82% of the benefits of the tax breaks will go to just 43,000 Americans who make over $1 million a year. And less than 3% will go to the great majority who earn less than $100,000 a year. And this is a provision that was inserted into the emergency bill. And that was the package that the Republicans put forward on a Sunday afternoon, tried to force an immediate vote. Then they accused the Democrats of delaying and obstructing their efforts to help the little people in America. And it was Nancy Pelosi's negotiation, which did include some pork, to be fair, that led to the expansion of unemployment benefits, the inclusion of some relief for student debt, and other parts of the Bernie Sanders agenda. So I think this is worth studying. I've included a link in the show file for today's podcast, if you would like to do so. Then there's a report from the Public Accountability Project that the corporations who have advised Trump not to fully use the Defense Production Act are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the channel used to lobby Trump. And this includes companies like 3M, manufacturing masks. General Electric does not want to be dictated to about producing ventilators. So it's a fascinating report. It runs more than 20 pages. But I've linked to it as well, and you can see how the lobby group of the Chamber of Commerce protects companies like 3M, Honeywell, General Electric, and many more who invest their money in the Chamber of Commerce so that it appears to be all business, including small business, that takes these positions that are counter to the interests of the American people. And as we've reported previously, the Defense Production Act is more than just telling GE to make ventilators. It allows the federal government to act as the kind of clearinghouse that governors have demanded that the Trump administration take on. And instead of having 50 states competing for scarce supplies of the protective gear for the frontline medical workers and ventilators and other equipment, it could be coordinated at the federal level. Now, Trump is pretending to use the DPA, but it's really only been used for publicity. And I think there have been 2 or 3 cases where they actually made a formal action under that law. Now, the corporate cronies of the Trump administration have been tapped for his new Opening Our Country Council, which, as I argued yesterday, is going to produce a report that Trump will never read or heed. But it draws people from 17 industry groups. They're all corporate except for Trumpka, Richie Trumpka, the president of the AFL-CIO. And like Trumpka, many of the corporate people didn't even know they were going to be named to this little committee. So that's how Trump is operating these days. And he's gone off the rails again. This is the guy who intentionally leaves many positions vacant in the administration, like at the State Department, where there are huge holes in the diplomatic corps, like all of these acting people who have to do his bidding, hoping to keep their job permanently. And this is a really strange one, because even Mitch McConnell doesn't agree with Trump's claim. Now, the other day he said when it comes to opening up our country that he's got total authority and the governors must kiss his ass. yesterday, he said that the way Congress is operating, they're not really in session because nobody wants to be in the chamber with the virus running around. And so they hold these pro forma sessions. And what it mainly does is prevent Trump from declaring that, for example, the Senate is in recess. And if it does that for more than 10 days, then he can make recess appointments, people who would serve until the next election. And Trump's main thing has been getting his right-wing young white male judges confirmed. And that's been going on at a really good clip from his point of view. But in another effort at distraction, a way to place himself above the Congress in the eyes of his moronic cult members, he is asserting that under a little-known clause in the Constitution, that he has total authority to tell the Congress, essentially to go on recess, and then he can make those recess appointments. Now, we don't know where this came from. If Mitch McConnell doesn't know about it, doesn't support it, well, it just seems to be one of those White House memos that somebody told him about. And he said, oh, let's try this. Let's show just how grandiose my vision of my power really is. But one of the requirements of Article 2 of the Constitution, which gives the president the power to adjourn Congress until a time of his choosing, if the House and Senate are unable to agree on when they should go out of session, well, there's no disagreement at this point. And so his attempt to insert himself is just pure idiocy. And even Jonathan Turley, the professor at George Washington, who testified pretty much in favor of Trump during the impeachment hearings, he said, no, that's just a pipe dream. And meanwhile, I want you to understand this sequence of events. We talked a little bit about it yesterday, the protests in Lansing, Michigan, of what appear to be these grassroots people who want their First Amendment rights back, the right to assembly. They're chafing at the stay-at-home restrictions, and to be fair, Michigan has some pretty severe ones. You're not even supposed to go across the street to see your neighbors. But it appears some people in Michigan are so idiotic that they need precise regulations like this. Nevertheless, they did a rally in their cars, jamming up the streets around the state capitol. And as I pointed out yesterday, one of the major funders is a political front group for the DeVos family and their Amway fortune. So I consider this to be AstroTurf, that form of fake activism. And what are they doing? Well, they're staging these events where 100 people show up. But it's enough to fill the screen on Fox News. And we call that B-roll. B-roll is what they put up on the screen to keep your eyes busy while the anchors drone on and on. And on Fox, as Robert Greenwald proved a few years back with his documentary Outfoxed, they pay close attention to B-roll. And there's a lot of scantily clad girls and pole dancers who show up in stories that are barely related to the news story at hand. And so Paul Waldman points out in an op-ed at the Washington Post today that Republicans are creating this. They're concocting it. And Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan said that the couple of hundred people who showed up so that Fox could shoot some B-roll yesterday, she said, it's not really about the stay-at-home order at all. It was essentially a political rally. But that gets picked up by the right-wing echo chamber. The woman who plays host on Fox, former Judge Jeanine Pirro, praised the Michigan protesters. God bless them. It's going to happen all over the country. Laura Ingraham, time to get your freedom back. Rush Limbaugh accused Whitmer of being a pawn of Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and I heard a rant that he delivered on my way to the secret studio this morning that was as bizarre as Trump's claims. And that is that Limbaugh is not really allowed to ask questions about where the coronavirus came from. He is pointing a finger at the Chinese biolab in Wuhan. And I have mentioned that as a possible suspect as well. But he claims that liberals have told him, Mr. Limbaugh, you can't talk about that. Well, I did, he did. So that's just pure fabrication. And even Trump's acting National Intelligence Director, who I don't believe has been proposed for confirmation to the Post, but, that's part of the soup that Trump was complaining about in threatening to throw Congress into recess. He put up a tweet with a picture of the Constitution and a caption, signed permission slip to leave your home. So here we go again. These male, white, there are some women, but these are right-wing Trump cult members, and they are trying to create the optics and the illusion that this is a massive movement. So it spread to the capital in Kentucky, and there are a couple of other states. There's a group in Idaho trying to gather enough people to fill the camera screen. And this is the real fake news. And there's a new study from the Committee to Protect Journalists cataloging a lengthy list of Trump's anti-press behaviors, from repeatedly tarring credible reporting with that tag, fake news, to trying to bar reporters from the White House, scrubbing or withholding information from government websites, and just making shit up. And that last part was from me and not the report. But the report does say that these attacks have endangered American democracy, imperiled press freedom, not just here, but in other countries, where the tag fake news is now routinely used just to dodge transparency or disclosure. So it's an interesting report. It was written by a former editor of the Washington Post. And, of course, it does pretend that the corporate media is faultless. And this is what gives Trump and his fake news claims and his repeated attacks on the media and the disgraceful questions and other lines that he throws out, because the corporate media is vulnerable. They have published information that is provably false. Some of it about Trump. And it creates the cycle of distrust in the media that we see today. And some of it is self-inflicted. And that's how Trump takes a shred of fact and blows it up into a big pile of BS. Here's today's coronavirus update report prepared by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, the number of reported confirmed COVID-19 cases, 2.1 million. Deaths, 140,000. The U.S. has 650,000 cases described as confirmed, with almost 31,000 deaths. In the Netherlands, they have conducted a study on what it looks like to reopen, suggesting that only a tiny percentage of people may have developed antibodies against COVID-19, reinforcing concerns about a second wave of infections and the difficulty of really defining the time of when it is safe to ease restrictions. And in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel yesterday laid out Germany's plan. Some small businesses will reopen next week, April 20, while schools will begin to gradually reopen on May 4th. The government extended social distancing measures until May 3rd. And this comes as New York City and Los Angeles have extended their respective restrictions until May 15th. There's also been an unexpected apology from the president of the European Commission, and it is aimed at Italy and the failure of the EU to respond when Italy threw up the red flag and begged for help as their hospitals and other facilities were being overrun with a wave of COVID patients. The apology extended to the failure of France and Germany, who imposed export bans on vital medical equipment. And in Italy, like here in the United States, there is a wave of deaths originating in nursing homes and other long-term care facilities. In Milan, at the largest care home, they have reported 190 deaths. Police on Wednesday seized documents connected to the Pio Albergo Trivulzio, which has more than 1,000 elderly residents. Here in the United States, governors in many states are making their own plans about how to so-called reopen. And while hospital capacity has improved in recent weeks, supply shortages remain crippling. Many regions are still restricting tests to people who meet specific criteria. And the lack of widespread testing has two devastating impacts. One is on the front end. We don't really know how many people are carrying the virus and how many can spread it to others. And secondly, we don't have the tools to evaluate people who are not carrying the virus, who therefore could go back to work. And in New York City, as I mentioned, Andrew Cuomo has extended till May 15th the stay-at-home order. And meanwhile, I guess to try to counter Trump and his claim of authority to solely decide when New York or other states and cities should be able to change their rules, he's reached into the corporate consultant ranks. He has hired McKinsey. He has brought back several corporate advisors who were on his staff before, and I guess he thinks that will inoculate him from Trump's power grab. And I do want to point out that while I support Governor Cuomo's rejection of Trump's claim that he alone can decide when to reopen, when to change these restrictions, that's a lie. But Andrew Cuomo has asserted that he has the authority to tell New York Mayor Bill de Blasio when he can, for example, reopen the schools. And I think that Cuomo's power grab is as odious as Trump's. One of the unexpected issues facing people who are anxious to receive their $1,200 payment from the government, which in too many cases will be a loan against your taxes next April. The concern that debt collectors, that state agencies that are owed taxes, and other garnishments might be imposed on this money, which is supposed to help people in need, but, as we pointed out, is primarily a way to stimulate the economy by giving cash to people who are likely to spend it right away because they don't have any other funds. And separately from the coronavirus issues here in the States, Linda notes that Admiral Michael Gilday has indicated that he may reinstate Captain Brett Crozier, the guy who was removed for sending the 4-page memo describing the situation on the Teddy Roosevelt. And the number of infected is up well over 800. One sailor has died. Brett Crozier himself is infected and reported to be battling the disease. So it would be an interesting confrontation with Trump if the top-ranking admiral reinstates Captain Crozier. I have applauded the efforts by various officials to reduce our prison population at the federal, state, and local level. And we now have the first case in the Willie Horton file. One day after officials in Hillsborough County, Florida, released more than 160 inmates, One of them went to Tampa and shot and killed a man. The suspect is Joseph Williams, age 26. He had been in the county jail there, and he qualified for release because he was being held on a nonviolent drug offense. But this, of course, will play big time on Fox News. Then Trump will see it, and he'll use this man, especially if he's African American, to demonize the pansies, the losers, who allowed men and women out of jail in an effort to reduce the spread of the coronavirus in the lockups. And there are reported serious glitches with the 80 million people who were supposed to get a direct deposit in their bank accounts yesterday of $1,200. Now, one of the glitches is that the IRS used tax filings from 2018. And if in 18 you got your refund from a direct deposit by the IRS, then you're on that list and you should have gotten your $1,200 yesterday. But anti-human Republican members of Congress are reporting anecdotes where people who have since died after 2018 have received payments of $1,200. Now, some of this appears to be far-fetched because, for example, bank accounts of people who die are typically closed within a couple of weeks. And I can understand had they mailed a check with the Donald signature on it, that might go to the household of a person who has since died. But the banks are pretty good about this, in my experience. And so I think it's got to be a pretty narrow set of dead people who got a $1,200 check from the government. But it only takes one, just like Willie Horton, to fill up the brains of people who are predisposed to be critical of these prisoner releases. And also critical of payments to people in need. Taxpayer money should only socialize the losses of corporate interests, not help little people through a crisis like this. So if you're on Social Security, and I traded email or Facebook comments with several Social Security recipients last night, those payments will be made, they tell us, later this month. Now we're halfway through, so that should be within 2 weeks. But there are other problems that have cropped up in that people who owe taxes, who have a garnish order on a paycheck, people who owe money to bill collectors, and even the ugly repo man. In some cases, the payment to the individuals will be reduced by collection efforts. Oh, and also, if you paid zero in taxes in 2018, you're kind of going to be the last to receive a check. Here in California, Governor Newsom has done something that is well-intended and looks good, but it's not enough. I mentioned yesterday that I'd seen a headline that he had approved payments to non-citizens, undocumented, or, if you must, illegal immigrants who are living and working here in California. Now, it's a good gesture. It's good optics for the governor. About half the money is being contributed by the state of California, the other half being raised by a charity. But it's just a one-time payment of $500 and a cap of $1,000 per household. And in California, that'll get you a tank of gas, pay your cell phone bill for a month, maybe some groceries. You might have a little left over to put toward your rent, which $500 would not come close to covering. And the ever-salacious listicle site BuzzFeed News reports that in Hawaii and Chicago, agencies have reported a surge in complaints from renters who can't pay the monthly rent, and they are being invited to pay it by having sex with their landlords. So one woman, this is in Hawaii, unable to pay her April 1 rent, said she texted a prospective landlord inquiring about a more affordable property, and he responded with a dick pic. Another newly unemployed woman said she asked her landlord if she could pay her April rent once she had work again. He said she should come over and spoon with him. And then in Chicago, where they're a little more direct, Cheryl Ring, legal director at Open Communities, said her organization has seen a threefold increase in sexual harassment complaints related to housing in just the past month. And I recall a movie called Grifters, back around 1990, where Angelica Houston and John Cusack were fighting over whether to run a short scam or a long scam. And Annette Bening had a supporting role, and she paid her rent by sexing up her landlord. As you may know, I have established the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, and I pumped in $1,200, imagining that I might get one of those loans from the government. In any event, over the next 60 days up till the middle of June, I am donating all of the subscription income that you listeners support my work with through your subscriptions. And we've gotten additional contributions. One gentleman asked to remain anonymous, who put in a little extra money yesterday. And today I do not have any new grant requests. So if you're a regular listener, if $100 would make a difference to you at this time, please send an email to peter@peterbcollins.com. No reasonable request is going to be turned down. And if you want to make a contribution to support our community and those who are in crisis right now, you can make a contribution via PayPal. You can either go to peterbcollins.com/sign up. You'll hit the page there, and there's information about how to make a direct contribution of any amount via PayPal. And if you don't like PayPal, you can use my P.O. Box, number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. And this offer is not limited to residents of the United States. Well, the editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, submitted to an interview with the Times new media columnist Ben Smith. He used to be the editor of BuzzFeed and the master of the listicle. And I admire Ben Smith for asking a tough question, because on Sunday, the Times posted and then Monday published their investigation of the claims of Tara Reade that she was sexually assaulted by Senator Biden when she was on his staff in 1993. And we've noted the widespread media blackout that was lifted by the Times shortly after Bernie Sanders exited the race, and nobody could challenge Joe Biden about this. And it's one of the things I discussed with Norman Solomon in our in-depth interview today. But Baquet, who, for example, back in, it was around 2004, Mark Klein, who's one of the whistleblowers who exposed the massive interception of our telephone traffic by the NSA in the United States in violation of the Fourth Amendment. He took his story to Dean Baquet, who was then the top editor at the Los Angeles Times. And not only did Baquet never publish anything about it, he turned the information over to Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's not very friendly to whistleblowers. So, in the current case, Tara Reade's accusations against Biden, the original draft of the article that was posted and then modified said this, quote, "No other allegation about sexual assault surfaced in the course of reporting, nor did any former Biden staff members corroborate any details of Ms. Reade's allegation." And here's the part that was edited out. "The Times found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Mr. Biden beyond the hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable." The Times subsequently deleted that last sentence, and Baquet admitted that he authorized that after being contacted by the Biden campaign, who complained that the phrasing was awkward and made it look like there were other instances in which he had been accused of sexual misconduct. And Smith said, well, why not explain that? Baquet: we didn't think it was a factual mistake. I thought it was an awkward phrasing issue that could be read different ways. It wasn't something factual we were correcting, so I didn't think that was necessary. And he tried to sweep it under the rug, and his own employee called him out on it. Another great report today from the American Prospect under the byline of Alexander Salmon. You know that Joe Biden has tipped toward Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All policy proposal and said, okay, I will advocate lowering the age of eligibility for Medicare from 65 to 60. Well, it turns out that would be a huge gift to the for-profit health insurance industry. Why? Because today, the people aged 60 to 64 are second only to the people over 65 in their use of the healthcare system and the cost of it. Now, Medicare already covers the seniors over 65, but if you were to take the most expensive group that's currently covered by the for-profit health insurance system, it would be those 60 to 64. And so, while on the face of it, Biden can spin this as a concession to Bernie Sanders and one more step on the road to Medicare for all, it is clearly a benefit to the corporate interests that Joe Biden has always been so good at representing. And these are among the issues that we talked about with Norman Solomon today in our in-depth interview. Here's an excerpt from that conversation where we talk about what happened in Iowa in 2016 and again in 2020 in the vote count of the caucuses.
Well, I was sort of waiting for Venezuela to offer to go to Iowa to help straighten out the vote count. But really, it was such a mess, and not the first time. You can give Iowa sort of an inverse opposite of credit. 2016 was ludicrous to claim that Hillary Clinton won that. It was at best for her a tie. It was determined by, I think, some coin flips. And then this time it was a catastrophe. It was ridiculous. That whole thing should have been thrown out in Iowa. And as you pointed out, Buttigieg just seized the initiative primetime night to claim to be a victor. And I think it goes to the underlying opportunism of so much of what's going on. I mean, election integrity, and you've covered it just extensively. We need such a great attention to all facets. It's the death of a thousand cuts for democracy in the way all this functions, and it's one of the reasons why I think it's been so useful to the establishment to point fingers at Russia. You know, every major problem and minor problem we have with voter suppression in the United States has zero to do with Russia. This is homegrown attacks on democracy that have damaged what democracy we have had. And looking ahead, I think that we've got to challenge this Russiagate mantra that the threats to our democracy are coming from some far-off species that speaks a really different language. This problem is homegrown, and it has to be solved by people here.
That's Norman Solomon, the progressive Democratic activist, a longtime supporter of Bernie Sanders. And I invite you to listen to the full interview with Norman. It's available today for my subscribers at TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, and, of course, at our home base, peterbcollins.com. And the New York Times today did an analysis of the pitiful presence on social media of Joe Biden. For example, he has a YouTube channel with a mere 32,000 subscribers, and that's at least 300,000 fewer than Trump. Joe Biden has followers around 7 million on Facebook and Twitter. Trump has 106 million. And one commentator they don't name, talking about the YouTube page, says, this video is 2 days old. It's sitting at 20,000 views. This is a guy who's supposed to beat Trump? And finally, a potential bribery scandal is swirling around the Republican head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. That would be Richard Burr of North Carolina. And he has already signaled that he is not running for re-election. And in preparation for that, he sold his townhouse, his crib in Washington, D.C. He sold it to a lobbyist who has lobbied him frequently, but according to the lobbyist, nothing since 2017. But that was the year that this lobbyist, whose name is John Green, purchased the townhouse for an above-market price, $900,000. Now, this is a violation of the Senate gift ban, and it reminds me of the case of Jimmy Traficant, one of the worst sporters of a wig in American political history, at least recently. He was a congressman from Ohio. He needed cash. So he went to one of his biggest donors, a man I've actually met. His name is Joe Cafaro. Joe approached me about helping his daughter get elected to Congress in the Cleveland area. And this would have been around 2004 or 2006. And over lunch at Midway Airport in Chicago, I said, you know, Mr. Cafaro, you paid Jimmy Traficant, you bought his boat for twice what everybody thought it was worth. Jimmy got impeached. Jimmy went to jail. And he said, so? That's how the game is played, friends, in our corrupt political campaign machinery. Thanks for joining me today for my news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.